My name is Claire Kelly. I am a captain in the United States Army. 4 weeks ago, while I was on a mission in a place where life was measured in seconds, my biological parents secretly sold the antique Steinway piano my dying grandmother had promised to leave me. They got rid of it for $95,000 just to trade it for a shiny Mercedes as a gift for my golden child sister to go hunting for a billionaire husband. They thought Grandma was so sick in the nursing home that she'd never know. They thought I was too weak to tell her. They were wrong. When I finally told her what they had done, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply reached for the phone, dialed a number, and said 7 words that would destroy everything my parents thought they owned. Before I tell you what those 7 words were and what happened next at my mother's 60th birthday party, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you truly like this story. Leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let me take you back to the day it all started, the afternoon my grandmother was taken to the nursing home. Tuesday, 4 p.m. The air inside Oak Creek Nursing Home was heavy with the smell of industrial-grade bleach and the faint, sweet rot of dying flowers. It was the kind of silence that tried too hard to be peaceful, but just felt hollow. Then, I stepped in. My combat boots hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, rhythmic thud. Each step carried a bit of the Wisconsin mud from the live fire range I'd just crawled out of. I hadn't even had time to shower. The grit was still under my fingernails, and the ghost weight of my service rifle was still pulling at my right shoulder. To anyone else, I looked like a soldier on leave. To the people in that waiting room, I was just a stain on the carpet. None of them looked up. In the far corner, my father, Richard, was leaned against the wall. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly base pay, but the collar was frayed, a cheap man's idea of a tycoon. His thumb was flying across an iPad screen, eyes locked on the red and green jagged lines of the stock market. He wasn't tracking his mother's heart rate, he was tracking his portfolio. My mother, Diane, was perched on the edge of a vinyl chair like she was afraid she'd catch something. She was clutching her Prada bag to her chest. Empty, probably, but she held it like it was a holy relic. Her face was a mask of calculated indifference, no tears, no smeared mascara. Just a look of deep, profound inconvenience. Across from her sat Megan. At 24, my little sister had mastered the art of being a professional victim. She was busy staring into a compact mirror, dabbing a fresh layer of Fenty gloss onto her pouty lips. The click, click, click of her long acrylic nails against the glass of her iPhone sounded like a death rattle in the quiet room. "Where is she?" I asked. My voice sounded like gravel compared to the soft hum of the air conditioning. Richard finally looked over his iPad. He didn't ask about the flight. He didn't ask why I looked like I'd just walked out of a war zone. He didn't even say hello. He just reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, and held it out. It was the first month invoice for the facility, $12,000. "She had a massive coronary," he said, his tone as flat as a weather report. "The doctors say she's a coin flip to see Monday. Since you're on leave and don't have anything important going on, you're taking the night watch." It wasn't a request. It was a deployment order. "I just got off a 48-hour tactical exercise, Richard," I said, my voice low. "I haven't slept since Sunday." "And I have a firm to run," he snapped, his eyes flicking back to his stocks. "Megan's got a dinner with Daniel Harrison at 7. That's a potential merger for this family. We can't have her looking like an extra from The Walking Dead because she was stuck in a hospital room all night." Megan didn't even look up from her mirror. "Seriously, Claire," she chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I've had this blowout scheduled for weeks. My hair is literally a disaster. You're already in uniform. It's not like you're going anywhere fancy." I looked at them. Really looked at them. 4 weeks ago, I was in a valley in Afghanistan, watching a 19-year-old kid from Ohio hold pressure on a teammate's femoral artery while RPGs whistled over our heads. That kid didn't complain about his blowout. He didn't talk about mergers. He just stayed. Because that's what you do when someone is down. Here, in the heart of the American Midwest, My grandmother was dying behind a set of double doors, and my sister was worried about her split ends. That suffocating lump in my throat, the one that had been building since I landed, felt like it was going to choke me. I swallowed it down. Hard. "I'll take the watch," I said. My spine went rigid. Standard military bearing. Richard didn't thank me. He just galled his iPad and nodded to Diane. They stood up in unison, like they'd just finished a tedious business meeting. They had what they wanted, a body to fill the chair so they could go home, uncork a bottle of Napa Cabernet, and pretend their lives weren't falling apart. As they reached the exit, Diane stopped. She turned back, her nose crinkling as she looked at my boots. The smell of her artificial grapefruit perfume hit me, sharp and cloying, cutting through the antiseptic air like a knife. She reached out and adjusted the collar of Megan's designer wool coat, smoothing it down with a maternal tenderness she'd never once shown me. Then, she spoke. She didn't whisper. She wanted me to hear it. "Let's go, honey," Diane said, her voice carrying across the sterile room. "At least the soldier girl is good for one thing. Cleaning up the goddamn mess." The words hit me harder than any shrapnel ever had. My jaw clenched so tight my molars ached. I watched them walk out the glass doors, the evening sun catching the fake gold on my father's watch as he signaled for the valet. They didn't look back. I stood there for a long minute, the only sound the distant, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor from down the hall. I wasn't just a daughter to them. I wasn't even a person. I was a service provider, a janitor in camouflage. I turned toward the heavy oak doors of the intensive care unit. I didn't wipe the mud off my boots. I let them scream against the floor as I walked away from their world and into the room where the only person who actually loved me was fading away. I reached for the cold brass handle, turned it, and stepped inside. The door hissed shut behind me, cutting off the scent of grapefruit and the sight of the Mercedes pulling into the lot. The real war was just beginning. The ICU didn't care about my fatigue. It only cared about the rhythm of the machines. I sat there in a hard plastic chair, the kind that's designed to keep you from ever getting comfortable. My spine was a steel rod, hands flat on my knees, feet planted. 48 hours without sleep wasn't just a memory. It was a physical weight pressing behind my eyes. But out in the field, you learn that sleep is a luxury, and duty is the only thing that keeps you breathing. The room was bathed in a sickly electric blue light from the monitors. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow whoosh of the ventilator and the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart rate tracker. Grandma Eleanor looked so small under those white sheets. Her skin was like translucent parchment, pulled tight over bone. Slowly, her hand moved. It was a shaky, agonizing crawl across the mattress until her fingers found mine. Her touch was icy, a sharp, clinical cold that made the hair on my arms stand up. In this city, in this family, her grip was the only thing that didn't feel like a transaction. "Where are they?" she rasped. Her voice was a dry rattle, like dead leaves blowing across a sidewalk. "They're busy, Grandma," I said. My voice was a flat, soldier's lie. No emotion, no tremor. I didn't tell her they were probably halfway through a bottle of expensive Merlot, complaining about the traffic. I didn't tell her they'd already treated her like a closed chapter. She let out a short, bitter huff that might have been a laugh if she had the breath for it. She knew. She'd always known. As I sat there, the rhythm of that ventilator started to sound like the ticking of a clock, dragging me back. Back to the good old days Diane loved to brag about at dinner parties. I remembered Christmas morning when I was 10. Megan had a mountain of gifts, dolls that talked, a miniature vanity, jewelry boxes. I got a single scratchy wool sweater from the clearance rack at Sears and a lecture from Richard about the value of $1. "We aren't made of money, Claire," he'd say, while Megan played with her new gold bracelet. "You're the big girl. You gotta be independent." Independence. That was their favorite word for neglect. When I turned 18, I didn't walk into the recruiter's office because I was chasing a flag. I walked in because I was chasing a way out. The GI Bill was my only ticket to a life where I didn't have to beg for the scraps from Megan's table. I traded my youth for a pair of combat boots and a rucksack just so I could have a bed that nobody could tell me I didn't earn. While Megan was picking out her first car, a Lexus my father bought in cash, I was eating lukewarm MREs in a dugout, wondering if I'd live to see 20. "The Steinway," Grandma whispered, snapping me back to the blue-lit room. She coughed, a wet, painful sound that shook her entire frame. Her grip on my hand tightened. "You still remember the promise, Claire?" I nodded. I could almost smell it, the scent of old oak, beeswax, and 100 years of dust. That 1892 Steinway sat in the center of her living room like a king on a throne. For 20 years, I was the only person in that house who actually touched it with respect. I was the one who spent Saturday mornings polishing every single ivory key until they shone like teeth. "It's yours," she said, her eyes suddenly clear and sharp as a bayonet. "You're the only one in this bloodline with hands that know how to bleed for what they love. Your father, he's a builder who only knows how to wreck things." I felt a lump in my throat, but I forced it down. "In the army, you don't cry. You execute." "I'll protect it, Grandma," I promised. Suddenly, her gaze shifted. It wasn't soft anymore. It was iron. She reached under her pillow with a trembling hand and pulled out a heavy, tarnished brass key. She pressed it into my palm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Go tomorrow morning," she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a superior officer. "Go to my house. Check on the piano. I got a feeling in my gut, Claire. A bad one. They're doing something. Something they think I'm too dead to notice." I took the key. It was cold, heavy, and felt like a warning. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own home, like you were the one doing all the heavy lifting while someone else got all the credit, hit that like button. It helps get Claire's story to the people who need to hear it. And do me a favor, drop a comment with the word duty, if you believe that blood doesn't always mean family. I want to see who's standing with me in this. The next morning, the Chicago sun was a pale, weak thing against the gray sky. I pulled my truck up to the curb in front of her old Victorian villa. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. I walked up the porch steps, my boots echoing on the wood. I pulled out the brass key. My hand didn't shake, but as I slid that cold metal into the lock, a shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the wind. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the air. I turned the key, the bolt clicking back with a heavy final sound. I pushed the door open, and the silence from inside hit me like a physical blow. The threshold of Grandma's Victorian house felt like a tripwire. Inside, the silence was heavy, smelling of mothballs and the lemon oil I'd used on the keys last month. But there was a gap in the air, a missing frequency. My eyes locked onto the corner of the parlor where the sun used to catch the gloss of the mahogany. The Steinway was gone. $95,000 of history, craftsmanship, and the only love I ever knew had been dragged out like trash while I wasn't looking. I knelt down on the floorboards. The red Persian rug held the ghost of its weight. 4 deep, rectangular dents where the legs had rested since the 50s. I touched the wool. It was still cold, depressed into the wood beneath. They didn't break in. No wood splinters, no shattered glass, no mud from a stranger's boots. They'd used a key. They'd walked in, probably laughing and checking their watches, while I was sitting in a plastic chair in a hospital hallway, watching a blue line crawl across a screen. I didn't feel the tears. I felt the pulse in my neck, thumping like a war drum. I was back in my truck before the front door even finished swinging shut. I drove like a woman possessed. The tires screamed against the cold Chicago asphalt as I headed toward the suburbs, toward the colonial house with the perfectly manicured lawn and the rot festering inside the walls. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the brass key Grandma gave me rattling in the cup holder like a taunt. I pulled into their driveway and saw it immediately. The silver Mercedes-Benz. It looked obscene under the orange glow of the streetlights. The hood was still warm, ticking as the metal cooled in the night air. I could smell the sharp, chemical scent of new leather through the vents as I walked past it. I didn't knock. I kicked the front door open. It slammed against the drywall with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot in the quiet neighborhood. The scene inside was a sick parody of a celebration. A bottle of expensive Cabernet was already open on the table, the deep red liquid staining the sides of the glasses. Richard was leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine, his eyes fixed on a real estate report like nothing had happened. Megan was standing by the mirror, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, jiggling a key fob with the silver star logo. "Where is it?" I rasped. My voice felt like it was full of glass. Richard didn't even flinch. He just took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. "Sold it," he said, his voice flat. "Buyer from New York. Paid cash. They picked it up this morning. That piano belonged to me. Grandma promised it to me before I even left for basic." "Grandma's senile, Claire," he snapped, finally looking at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "She doesn't know what she's promising half the time. Besides, look at you. You ain't ever here. You're in a barracks or a hole in the ground halfway across the world. You gonna haul a Steinway to your next deployment? It was sitting there rotting." Megan needed that ride. Megan chimed in, her voice a sharp, entitlement-filled whine. "The Harrison merger depends on us looking like we belong in their world. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was cruising around in that beat-up Ford? This Mercedes is for the family. For our future. It's an investment." I stepped toward her, my combat boots loud on their polished floor. I was a head taller than her, built of lean muscle and 7 years of grit. She didn't even blink. She knew Richard was right there. "You sold my inheritance for a piece of German engineering?" "Stop being so damn dramatic," Megan spat, checking her reflection again. "You're always so jealous of me. Grandma's practically gone, Claire. She doesn't need a piano in a dark, dusty house. You're just being selfish because you want to hoard it for some sentimental bullshit. I'm actually using the value to build something real." I looked at the wine in Richard's glass. I looked at the smug grin on Megan's face. I didn't see people. I saw scavengers picking over a body before it was even cold. I pulled my phone out. My hand was steady, but my mind was a tactical map of every bridge I was about to burn. "I'm calling the cops," I said. "Then I'm calling Harold. Then I'm going to the hospital to tell her what you did." The chair scraped back. Richard stood up, his face reddening. But Diane appeared from the kitchen like a ghost in silk. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She moved fast, grabbing my wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Her long red acrylic nails sank into the soft skin of my inner wrist, biting deep. I felt the sharp sting of them breaking the surface. 4 points of fire. "You do that," she hissed, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of grapes and malice. "And you kill your grandmother." I stared at her, frozen. "She's weak, Claire. Her heart is a ticking bomb," Diane said, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You walk in there and tell her we sold her precious piano. The shock will end her, right then, right there in that bed. You want her blood on your hands? You want to be the one who kills her over 95 grand? She was using her own mother's life as a tactical shield. I looked down at her hands. The red polish was the same color as the blood welling up around her nails on my wrist. I felt a coldness settle over me. Not fear, not even anger anymore. Just a hard, crystalline clarity. I yanked my hand back. The scratches burned like hell. "Get out," Richard said, dismissive as he sat back down to finish his drink. "Go back to the base and play soldier. Leave the real-world decisions to the people who are actually here." I didn't say a word. I turned on my heel and walked out, the front door swinging open to the night. The Chicago wind hit me, sharp and clean. I stood by my truck, looking at the silver Mercedes and the scratches on my wrist. I didn't call the police. I didn't cry. I looked at the light in their dining room window. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. I was going to end it. The sun didn't shine in the ICU. It just leaked through the blinds in thin, gray strips that looked like prison bars on the linoleum. 800 hours. I stood at the foot of Grandma Eleanor's bed. My back was a straight line, shoulders back, chin up. I hadn't showered since I left the firing range, and the dried mud on my boots had turned into a fine, pale dust. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't bring a card. In the Army, when the situation is terminal, you don't offer platitudes, you offer a sitrep. The heart monitor was the only thing talking. Beep, beep, beep. a steady clinical countdown. I looked at the woman who raised me, the only person who didn't look at me like a line item on a balance sheet. Her eyes were closed, but I knew she was awake. She was a soldier in her own way. She was waiting for the report. "Sit rep, Grandma," I said. My voice was gravel and ice. No tremor, no tears. "The objective has been compromised." Her eyelids fluttered open, those gray eyes, sharp as flint, locked onto mine. She didn't move. She just waited. "They sold the Steinway. Yesterday morning," I continued. Every word felt like a stone dropping into a well. 95,000 cash. Richard bought a silver Mercedes for Megan. A gift for the Harrison merger. They told me if I spoke a word to you, the shock would kill you. They said I'd be the one who put you in the ground. I braced myself. I expected her heart rate to spike. I expected the machines to scream. I expected her to crumble into the white sheets. But the monitor didn't change its tune. Beep. 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 Grandma Eleanor let out a long, slow breath. She didn't look shocked. She looked confirmed. She closed her eyes again for a second, a small bitter shadow of a smile touching her cracked lips. "I hoped they wouldn't," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "But I knew they would." She reached out with a trembling hand, pointing toward the heavy black landline phone on the bedside table. "Dial number 2 on the speed dial," she commanded. "Put it on speaker." I did exactly what I was told. The line clicked. 1 ring, 2. Then a man's voice picked up. Deep. Professional. "Jennings here." Grandma didn't waste time on hellos. She gripped the edge of the blanket, her knuckles white and bony. Her voice was thin, but it held the weight of a hammer. "I am dying. Activate Plan B now." 7 words. 7 cold, hard words that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. "Understood, Eleanor," the voice responded. "I'll be there in 2 hours." The line went dead. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of a hospital room anymore. It was the silence of a fuse burning down toward a crate of TNT. Exactly 2 hours later, the heavy oak doors of the ward swung open. A man in a charcoal gray suit walked in. He wasn't tall, but he owned every square inch of the room. Harold Jennings. I recognized the gait. I recognized the way he scanned the exits. Harold was a retired JAG, a military lawyer who'd spent 30 years navigating the dark underbelly of the Uniform Code of Military Justice before he went into private practice for Grandma. He looked at my uniform, then at the rank on my chest. He didn't offer a handshake. He just gave me a sharp, professional nod. "Captain Kelly." "Mr. Jennings." He didn't bring a get-well balloon. He brought an old, scuffed black leather briefcase that looked like it had seen a few wars of its own. He walked over to the bed, looked at Grandma, and she gave him a single, infinitesimal nod. "Outside, Captain," Harold said, gesturing toward the hallway. We stood in the corridor, the air smelling of floor wax and desperation. Harold didn't beat around the bush. He pulled a thick, heavy manila folder from his briefcase and slapped it into my hands. The sound was a dull, heavy thud against the wood of a nearby chart station. "Your grandmother is a hell of a strategist, Claire," Harold said, adjusting his glasses. "She's been baiting a trap for 5 years. She wanted to see if her son had a shred of integrity left, or if he'd finally tripped the wire. Richard just stepped on the mine." I opened the folder. The first page was a property deed. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes narrowing as the reality of it hit me like a physical blow. "The house in the suburbs," I muttered. "The colonial where they're throwing the party." "On paper, it doesn't belong to them," Harold said, his voice dropping an octave. "They've been living there for 10 years on your grandmother's dime, playing the role of the wealthy real estate moguls while she paid the taxes and the mortgage. 5 years ago, she moved every single asset she owns, the house, the accounts, the stocks, into an irrevocable trust." I turned the page. My name was at the bottom in bold, black ink. Beneficiary, Claire Kelly. "Everything belongs to you, Claire," Harold said. He leaned in, his eyes cold behind the lenses. "The piano was part of that trust. By selling it, Richard didn't just steal from a dying woman. He committed felony embezzlement against a legal entity he has no control over. I looked back through the glass window at Grandma. She was staring at the ceiling, waiting. "They're throwing a 60th birthday bash for your mother this Sunday," Harold continued, checking his watch. "The cream of Chicago real estate will be there, the Harrisons, the media, the people Richard needs to impress to keep his house of cards from falling over." I felt a cold, hard clarity settle in my gut. It was the same feeling I got right before an ambush. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a crystalline focus. "You have the legal right to evict them right now," Harold said. "You could have the sheriff there in an hour, but your grandmother wants more than an eviction. She wants a court-martial." I closed the folder. The weight of it felt good in my hands, like a loaded weapon. "Sunday," I said. My voice was a flat line. "We wait for Sunday." Harold gave me a grim smile. "D-Day is set. I'll have the papers ready." I turned back to the room, the sound of the heart monitor echoing in the hallway. The fuse was almost at the end, and Richard had no idea he was standing right on top of the blast zone. Sunday, 3 p.m. The Chicago sun was a pale, blinding disk hanging over the suburbs. It hit the white siding of the colonial house, making the whole place look like a postcard for the American dream. But the dream was rotten at the center. I could smell it from the driveway, not just the scent of manicured lawns and fresh mulch, but the cloying, heavy stench of expensive perfume trying to mask a lie. Inside, the house was crawling with 30 of the city's finest social climbers, the who's who of second-tier real estate and local money. They were huddled in groups, holding crystal flutes filled with French champagne that probably cost more than a soldier's monthly grocery bill. I stood in the corner of the dining room, leaning my back against the eggshell white wallpaper. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I was in a sharp navy suit, clean-shaven, hands folded in front of me. I felt like a sniper at a garden party. My eyes didn't track the tray of salmon canapes circling the room. They tracked the targets. I looked at the far corner of the parlor. The spot where the 1892 Steinway should have been was occupied by a massive, ugly-looking potted palm. The green fronds reached toward the ceiling, a cheap, desperate attempt to fill the void where history used to live. It was an insult, a 6-foot distraction meant to hide a felony. The red Persian rug still showed the faint, ghost-like indentations of the piano's legs. To everyone else, it was just furniture. To me, it was a crime scene. Richard stepped to the center of the room. He looked every bit the successful mogul, his face flushed a deep, winey red from the Napa Cabernet and the high of his own vanity. He tapped a silver spoon against his glass. Ting, ting, ting. The sound was sharp, arrogant. The room went silent. Richard reached out and pulled Megan and an older man toward him. The man was Harrison, the real estate kingpin my father had been chasing for a decade. "Friends, neighbors," Richard boomed, his voice carrying that fake, booming warmth he saved for people he wanted things from. "Today is about more than just Diane hitting 60. It's about legacy. It's about family taking care of their own. If you'll all take a look out the front window." The guests turned in unison, necks craned. Through the blinds, the silver Mercedes-Benz sat in the driveway, its metallic paint shimmering under the afternoon sun like a shark in shallow water. "That car," Richard said, his voice dropping to a tone of rehearsed reverence, "is a gift from Grandma Eleanor. She's been watching Megan work so hard, and she decided it was time for a reward. She liquidated a portion of her private collection, assets she felt were better used for the next generation, to invest in her granddaughter's future. It's a symbol of where this family is headed." The room erupted into polite, shallow applause. "How generous," someone whispered. "What a wonderful grandmother," another chimed in. Diane dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, putting on a show of maternal pride. Not a single tear actually hit the fabric. Megan beamed, her blonde hair catching the light as she squeezed Daniel Harrison's arm. She looked like she'd just won the lottery, which, in a way, she had, by stealing it from a woman breathing through a tube. Megan's eyes scanned the room until they locked onto mine in the corner. She didn't look guilty. She looked triumphant. She whispered something to Daniel, then broke away, her heels clicking a rhythmic, sharp beat on the hardwood floors. She stopped 3 feet from me, a half-full glass of champagne in her hand. Her lip curled into a thin, nasty line. "Don't look so sour, Captain," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "It's a party. Try to smile. I'm sure Grandma left you something in a box somewhere. Maybe some of those old, dusty books she liked? Or some rusty medals. You know, things for people who don't have a real life to lead." I didn't blink. I didn't move. I looked at the gold watch on my wrist. 3:15 p.m. Right on schedule. "Enjoy the car, Megan," I said. My voice was low, steady, and cold as a winter morning in the mountains. "Make sure you keep the tank full. You're gonna need it." Suddenly, the buzz of the party was sliced open. Aunt Margaret, Diane's younger sister, stepped into the middle of the circle. She wasn't holding a glass. She was holding a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She pointed a shaking finger at the potted palm. "You're a liar, Richard," Margaret shouted. The music seemed to die in the walls. "You sold Eleanor's Steinway while she was lying in the ICU. I talked to the nurses. You didn't even visit her the day the movers came. How much did you get? How much did it cost to buy your daughter's way into this room?" The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Richard's face went from flushed red to a sickly, mottled white. He started to stammer, his hands shaking as he gripped his glass. "Now, Margaret, you don't understand the arrangement. She wasn't even using it. It was an asset." "She's still alive, Richard," Margaret screamed. "It wasn't yours to sell." Before Richard could find another lie to hide behind, the heavy front door swung open. It didn't just open, it hit the wall with a dull, authoritative thud. A shadow stretched across the foyer, long and dark. A voice, deep and gravelly like stones grinding together, cut through the perfume and the champagne bubbles. "I believe the lady asked you a question, Richard, and I'd suggest you answer it carefully." Harold Jennings stepped into the light. He wasn't smiling. He was holding a black briefcase, and he looked like the end of the world. Harold Jennings didn't knock. He didn't have to. He moved through the foyer of the colonial house like a man who already owned the land it sat on. He walked past the buffet table, ignoring the expensive shrimp cocktail and the terrified gazes of the guests, and stopped right next to that pathetic potted palm tree. He stood where the Steinway used to be, a placeholder for a ghost. "Actually," Harold started. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a jagged, gravelly edge that sliced right through the ambient jazz playing on the speakers. "I think the truth deserves a bigger audience, Richard. Don't you?" The room went graveyard quiet. 30 of Chicago's self-proclaimed elite froze, their champagne glasses halfway to their lips. My father, Richard, stood there with a wine stain blooming on his white shirt like a fresh wound. His face had gone from the flushed red of a winner to the gray, sickly shade of a man watching his parachute fail. "Harold," Richard stammered, his voice thin. "What the hell is this? This is my wife's birthday. Get out before I call the cops." Harold didn't flinch. He just unzipped that scuffed leather briefcase. The sound of the zipper was like a bone saw in the silence. "Your house?" Harold pulled out a thick stack of documents, the paper crisp and white under the chandelier. "That's the first lie we're gonna burn today, Richard." He didn't hand the papers over. He held them up for the whole room to see. "According to the Cook County property records and the deed currently sitting in my hand," Harold said, his eyes scanning the crowd, "the sole owner of this property is Eleanor Whitmore. Richard, Diane, you ain't owners, you're guests. For 10 years, you've been living here as tenants at will, squatting on a dying woman's generosity while you played the big-shot real estate moguls." The air left the room. I watched Mr. Harrison, the man Richard had been sucking up to all night, take a slow, deliberate step back. He looked at my father like he'd just realized he was shaking hands with a con man. Diane's hand was shaking so hard that the tray of glasses she was holding started to chatter. Clink, clink, clink. "That's a lie," Megan screamed. She pushed her way to the front, her face twisted in a snarl. "Grandma promised us this house. It's our inheritance. She's senile. She doesn't know what she's doing." Harold adjusted his glasses. He looked at Megan with a pity that was colder than any insult. 5 years ago," Harold said, his voice dropping into a low, clinical tone, "your grandmother grew concerned about some financial irregularities. She didn't want her life's work being gambled away on bad stocks and silver Mercedes-Benzes. So, she moved every single asset, this house, the investment accounts, the savings, into an irrevocable trust. Harold turned toward me. He didn't smile. He just gave me a sharp, military nod. And the sole beneficiary of that trust, the person who legally owns every stick of furniture and every brick in these walls, is Captain Claire Kelly. Megan's knees didn't just buckle. She collapsed onto the sofa, her fenny-glossed mouth hanging open in a silent sob. Richard let out a sound, a guttural, animalistic roar. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "You!" he spat. "You poisoned her mind. You used that uniform to trick a sick old woman." "Quiet, Richard," Harold snapped. The authority in his voice was absolute. "We ain't done. Selling that 1892 Steinway was the last mistake you're ever gonna make. That piano was a registered asset of the trust. By selling it without authorization, you didn't just pull a fast one on your mother. You committed felony embezzlement." Harold pulled a final document from his bag, a formal demand for restitution. He slapped it onto the mahogany dining table. The sound was like a gunshot. "The buyer in New York has already been contacted. The sale is being flagged as fraudulent," Harold said. "Richard, you have 30 days to get $95,000 back into the trust's account. If you don't, the captain here has authorized me to hand this file directly to the district attorney. You won't be celebrating your next birthday in the suburbs. You'll be doing it in a state facility." Richard slumped. The mogul was gone. He looked small, shriveled. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, gasping for air as if the very walls of the house were closing in on him. The guests were already moving toward the door, leaving their half-eaten salmon behind, desperate to get away from the stench of the collapse. If you've ever sat at a table where people treated you like you were nothing while they built their lives on the things you sacrificed, hit that like button right now. Let's show them that the soldier girls of the world are finally taking back what's theirs. Drop a "not today" in the comments if you've ever had to stand your ground against a family that only loved what you could do for them, not who you were. I want to see you standing there with me. I stood in the center of the room. I didn't feel happy. I felt clean. The silver Mercedes sat in the driveway, a $95,000 monument to their greed. Harold walked over to me and handed me the heavy manila folder. The weight of it felt right in my hands. "It's your call now, Claire," Harold whispered. "You want to file the charges, or you want to give them the 30 days. I looked at my father, then at my mother, who was hiding her face behind her silk handkerchief. I didn't see my parents. I saw two targets in a landscape I had already conquered. I looked at the silver key in my hand, the one to the house they thought was theirs. I didn't say a word. I just walked to the front door and opened it wide, letting the cold Chicago wind sweep the smell of their perfume right out into the street. 30 days, I said. My voice was a flat line. And I want the keys to the Mercedes on the table before I count to 10. Diane didn't look like a mother anymore. She looked like a trapped coyote, teeth bared and eyes wild. Her mascara had surrendered, running down her cheeks in jagged black streaks that made her face look like it was cracking open. She lunged toward me, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves. She didn't try to hug me. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She pointed a trembling, red-tipped finger inches from my nose. "You snake!" she shrieked. Her voice hit a frequency that made the champagne flutes on the table hum. "You've been planning this, haven't you? Sitting in that hospital room, whispering in that old woman's ear while she's half out of her mind. You were always jealous of Megan. Always. You couldn't stand that she was the one who actually stayed. That she was the one who was here while you were off playing soldier in the dirt. She was using the old playbook. Step 1, make Claire the villain. Step 2, paint Megan as the martyr. Step 3, hope the audience buys the lie." The 30 guests, the elite of the Chicago suburbs, stood frozen. I could see their reflections in the polished mahogany of the dining table. They were leaning in, eyes wide, waiting for the explosion. They wanted to see the captain break. They wanted tears. They wanted a screaming match. I didn't give them a damn thing. I stood my ground. My boots were planted shoulder-width apart, my weight centered. My back was a straight line of cold, hard steel. I didn't blink. I didn't recoil. I just watched her. I watched the way her chest heaved and the way Richard's hands shook as he tried to hide his stained shirt behind his back. The pain they were trying to shove down my throat? It didn't taste like anything anymore. The golden child narrative was a burnt-out shell, and I was the one holding the match. I didn't sell the Steinway, Diane, I said. My voice wasn't loud. It was just heavy. It carried the weight of 7 years of tactical silence. I didn't steal $95,000 from a woman on a ventilator. I didn't buy a silver Mercedes with blood money just to impress a man I barely know. And I sure as hell didn't stand in a hospital hallway and threaten my own daughter to keep a felony quiet. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locking onto Richard. He looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing in the middle of a minefield with a heavy foot. Then I looked at Megan, still huddled on the sofa, her face a mask of ruined makeup and shattered pride. You called me a soldier girl when you thought I was just the janitor for your messes, I continued. The room felt smaller now, the air growing thin as the truth took up all the space. Out in the valley, I've bled for people who didn't even know my name. I've carried men twice my weight through mud and fire because that's what loyalty looks like. That's what a family is supposed to be. You protect the person next to you. You don't sell their soul for a car lease. Richard tried to find his voice. It came out as a pathetic, wet wheeze. Claire, listen. We're your parents. You can't do this to us. Think about the scandal. Think about what people will say. I am thinking about it, I said. I stepped into the center of the room, right under the chandelier. I spent 18 years trying to be enough for you. I went to war so I wouldn't have to ask you for a dime. I did the work. I took the hits. And while I was gone, you picked my grandmother's bones clean. I looked at the guests. I saw the judgment in their eyes, and for the first time, it wasn't directed at me. Old man Harrison was the first to move. He didn't look at Richard. He looked at his son, Daniel, and gave a short, sharp jerk of his head toward the foyer. Daniel, we're leaving. Megan let out a strangled cry, reaching for Daniel's arm. Daniel, wait, it's not what it looks like. Harold is just a bitter old man. Daniel Harrison didn't even look at her. He pulled his arm away like she was covered in something contagious. Save it, Megan, he snapped. My father doesn't do business with thieves, and I don't date them. The exodus was fast, brutal. The sound of high heels clicking toward the door was like a hail of gunfire. No one said goodbye. No one thanked Diane for the champagne. They scrambled out of that house like rats off a sinking ship, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and the taste of stale caviar behind. Richard stood in the middle of his empty parlor, his face an ashen gray. The mogul was dead. The elite were gone. Only 4 of us were left. Me, my parents, and Harold Jennings. Harold reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't in a manila folder this time. It was just a stark, white document with a blue legal seal at the bottom. He didn't hand it to Richard. He handed it to me. It's a 24-hour notice, Captain, Harold said, his voice flat and clinical. Under the terms of the irrevocable trust, you are the primary resident and trustee. You have the legal authority to terminate their occupancy immediately. 1 signature, and the sheriff's department will be here by tomorrow evening to clear the premises. I felt the weight of the paper in my hand. It was light, but it felt like a heavy weapon. Richard was staring at the paper, his mouth working silently, like a fish gasping on the sand. Diane was leaning against the wall, her eyes burning with a hatred that finally had nowhere to go. I looked at the silver Mercedes through the front window. Then I looked at the scratches on my wrist where Diane's nails had dug in. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a single drop of guilt. I walked over to the mahogany dining table, picked up a silver pen, and pressed the tip to the paper. The ink flowed smooth and black. 24 hours, I said, my voice as cold as the wind off Lake Michigan. Start packing the suitcases Grandma bought you, because by sunset tomorrow, I'm changing the locks. I didn't wait for them to speak. I turned on my heel and walked out the front door, the sound of my boots hitting the porch like a final slamming gavel. The house was a graveyard of suburban ambition. Empty crystal flutes sat on every flat surface, some tipped over, wine bleeding into the white lace runners like fresh wounds. The smell of cold shrimp and Diane's sharp citrusy perfume hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Richard was slumped in a wingback chair, staring at the floorboards as if they were made of glass about to shatter. Diane stood by the window, her arms wrapped tight around her waist, watching the last of the elites peel away from the curb in their luxury SUVs. No one had stayed to help clean up. The vultures had seen the body, and they'd flown. I looked at the 24-hour eviction notice in my hand. It was a death warrant for their social lives. I could have signed it right then. I could have called a locksmith and had their designer luggage tossed into the driveway before the morning dew hit the grass. It would have been easy. It would have been the kind of burning down the house revenge I dreamed about in the middle of a freezing Afghan winter. But I wasn't a civilian. I wasn't a kid looking for a tantrum. I was a captain in the United States Army. I didn't operate on petty spite. I operated on standards, discipline, results. "I'm not doing this to destroy you," I said. My voice was like a flat blade, cutting through the stagnant air of the parlor. Richard didn't look up, but his shoulders hitched. "I'm doing this because there has to be a baseline, a floor. And you two just fell right through it." I reached into Harold's briefcase. I didn't pull out the eviction order. I pulled out a fresh manila folder. I didn't hand it to Richard. I dropped it on the mahogany dining table. The thwack of it hitting the wood was the only sound in the house. "What is that?" Richard wheezed. He finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the mogul mask long gone. His charcoal suit was bunched at the shoulders, making him look smaller than I remembered. "A lease agreement," I said. "Your new reality." I walked over to the window, standing between Diane and the silver Mercedes sitting in the driveway. "You have 90 days to get $95,000 back into Grandma's trust, not 30. I'm giving you time to sell the junk you bought. You can stay in this house. For 12 months after Eleanor passes." Richard's mouth opened, a flicker of that old, manipulative hope crossing his face. I crushed it before he could speak. "But you are no longer the owners. You are tenants, my tenants. You'll pay market rate rent on the 1st of every month. The money goes directly into Eleanor's care fund. You miss a day? You're out. You damage a wall? Out. You try to pawn a single piece of her silver? Harold calls the district attorney." Richard looked at the document as if it were a coiled snake. To a man who built his life on the illusion of being the king of the suburbs, signing a lease with the daughter he called a janitor was a slow-motion execution. It was the ultimate humiliation. Every month, he'd have to write my name on a check just to keep a roof over his head. Diane let out a jagged, dry sob that sounded more like a rattle than a cry. Megan stood up from the sofa, her face a ruin of expensive makeup and cheap entitlement. "The car, Claire. You can't. If I don't have the Mercedes, everyone will know. Daniel Harrison is already ghosting my texts. I'll have nothing." "The car goes back to the dealership tomorrow morning, Megan," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "You take the trade-in value. You eat the 15 grand loss. Then you take whatever's left, buy a used Corolla, and go find a job at the mall. The hunt is over. Welcome to the real world." Richard reached for a silver pen. His hand was shaking so bad the pen rattled against the table like a telegraph key. He leaned over the document, his suit bunching at the neck. He looked old, shrunken, small. The sound of the pen nib scratching against the heavy bond paper was loud in the empty house. Scritch, scritch. He pressed so hard on the signature line that the metal tip tore a jagged hole in the corner of the page. He didn't say a word. He just pushed the folder toward me and buried his face in his palms. Diane followed, her signature a sharp, frantic mess of ink that barely stayed within the lines. I picked up the folder and handed it to Harold. He gave me a thin, professional nod and slid it into his briefcase. The transaction was over. The chain of command was restored. "Pack the suitcases Grandma bought you," I said to the room. "I'm changing the locks next week. You'll get your new keys when the first month's deposit clears. I turned on my heel. Harold followed. I didn't look back at the people sitting in the ruins of their own greed. I didn't want to see their faces. I wanted the cold air. I wanted the silence of the Chicago night. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the heavy oak door shut. It closed with a deep, final thud that vibrated in my chest. The Chicago wind hit me like a slap, sharp and biting. I leaned against my truck and took a long, cold breath. The smell of grapefruit and lies was gone. The air out here tasted like iron and snow. I was free. I climbed into the cab, the engine roaring to life, a rough, honest sound that drowned out the quiet of the suburbs. I pulled away, the silver Mercedes disappearing in my rearview mirror. I had one more stop to make. But as I hit the main road, my phone buzzed. A text from a blocked number. I know where you hid the rest. My heart didn't skip a beat. It just turned to ice. The first domino didn't fall with a crash. It fell with a whisper. On Tuesday morning, Richard lost the $200,000 development deal with the Harrison Group. The email was 5 lines long. It said the firm didn't do business with people who lacked core integrity. It didn't mention the piano. It didn't have to. In Chicago's real estate circles, a man who robs his own mother in a hospital bed is a liability you don't keep on the books. 3 days later, Daniel Harrison ghosted Megan. He didn't call. He just blocked her on every platform. Megan had to drive that silver Mercedes back to the dealership alone. She walked out of the lot with a check that was $15,000 short of what they'd paid and a set of bus passes. The golden child was now taking the CTA to a part-time shift at a suburban mall. My phone didn't stop buzzing for a week. Pick up, Claire. We're family. You've ruined us, you bitch. Please, Claire, we can't pay the rent. I didn't answer a single one. I didn't feel the need to argue. In the Army, when a mission is over, you don't hang around the target area to discuss the damage. You exfil. I blocked their numbers. I wiped the call logs. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was just the landlord they couldn't afford. 3 weeks later, the air in the ICU changed. The industrial bleach smell seemed thinner, replaced by the heavy, still scent of the end. I sat in that same plastic chair, my back against the wall. I held Grandma Eleanor's hand. Her skin felt like cold silk over dry twigs. She couldn't talk anymore. The stroke had taken her voice, but her eyes were still flinty, still sharp. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a tear track through the wrinkles at the corner of her eye. It wasn't fear. It was an apology. She was sorry she'd left me alone in that house for 18 years. She was sorry she hadn't seen the rot in Richard sooner. "I'm okay, Grandma," I whispered. I leaned in close, my lips near her ear. "I won. The house is mine. The keys are in my pocket. You can go now. The watch is over." She gave my hand one last microscopic squeeze. Then the monitor pulled a long, high-pitched beep that filled the room. The green line went flat. The strategist had left the field. She went out with her head held high, and I didn't shed a single tear until the nurse walked in to call the time of death. The day of the funeral, Chicago decided to weep. A cold, gray drizzle soaked into the stone walls of the church. I stood in the foyer, adjusting the lapels of my Army service uniform. The dark blue wool was heavy, and the rows of ribbons on my chest felt like armor. Every brass button was polished to a mirror finish. My hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it hurt. That was the point. Discipline is the only thing that keeps you from shattering when the world turns to glass. My parents arrived late. Of course they did. They walked down the aisle with their heads down, Diane wearing oversized Gucci sunglasses to hide the fact that her eyes weren't red from crying, but from the stress of being broke. Richard looked like he'd aged a decade in a month. His suit was wrinkled. He looked like a man who was finally realizing that you can't eat prestige. They sat in the very last row, as far from the casket as they could get. They were pariahs. Every neighbor, every old friend, every person who had been at that birthday party looked right through them. The isolation was absolute. The Kelly name was a brand that had gone bankrupt in a single afternoon. No one stood up to give a eulogy. Richard didn't have the guts, and Megan was too busy hiding her face in a handkerchief. I stood up. I didn't walk to the pulpit. I didn't have a speech written on a napkin. I walked over to the old upright piano sitting near the altar. It wasn't a Steinway, but it had ivory keys and a soul. I sat down on the bench, my spine a straight line. I didn't look at the pews. I looked at the sheet music in my head. I played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The notes were lonely. They were cold. They echoed through the high stone arches of the church, cutting through the sound of the rain hitting the stained glass. This was the music she'd taught me when I was 10, back when I still thought my father loved me, back when I thought I had a home. With every chord, I felt the last threads of that old life snapping. I hit the final lingering note and let it fade into the silence. I stood up. I walked to the edge of the casket and snapped a sharp, crisp military salute. I held it for 3 seconds. A final report to my commanding officer. Then I turned on my heel. My boots clicked against the stone floor, a sharp rhythmic sound that didn't falter. I walked past the back row. Richard reached out, his hand trembling, trying to grab the sleeve of my uniform. "Claire, please. We have nowhere else to go." I didn't stop. I didn't look down. I just kept walking until I hit the heavy oak doors. I pushed them open and stepped out into the rain. I didn't have a family anymore. I had a mission. And the mission was finally, bloody well over. 6 months. That was all it took for the rot to clear out. Richard and Diane didn't make it to the 12-month mark, living in a neighborhood where the mailman, the grocery clerk, and the local butcher all knew you were the kind of people who'd rob a dying woman was a slow, agonizing poison. Social suicide in the suburbs is a quiet affair. No one yells. They just stop inviting you. They stop looking you in the eye when you're checking your mail. The mogul and his wife couldn't breathe in the vacuum they'd created. They slunk away at 0200 hours on a rainy Tuesday. I watched them from the dark cabin of my truck across the street. No professional movers this time, no Harrison Group perks, just a rented U-Haul and a dozen sagging cardboard boxes they'd probably scavenged from a dumpster behind the mall. I watched Richard struggle with a heavy trunk, his face purple, his breathing ragged in the damp Chicago air. He looked shrunken. His expensive wool coat was stained at the hem. Diane didn't look back. She just climbed into the passenger seat of their used sedan, her head down, finally hiding from the world she'd tried so hard to conquer with lies. The house didn't feel empty when they left. It felt scrubbed. It felt like the air had finally been filtered after years of breathing in a slow gas leak. I didn't step out to say goodbye. I didn't offer a hand. In the Army, when a hazardous unit is relocated, you don't wave. You just check the perimeter. I sat there in the silence, my hands steady on the steering wheel, until their taillights disappeared into the gray fog of the outskirts. The tumor was out. The margins were clean. A week later, my phone buzzed while I was at the hardware store. A number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some old, tactical instinct made me thumb the screen. "Claire?" The voice was thin, brittle. It didn't have the sharp, entitled whine of the Megan I knew. It sounded like someone who'd been walking in the rain for a very long time. "I'm on the 22 bus," she said. I could hear the hiss of the air brakes and the low, tired mumble of the morning commuters in the background. "I'm going to my shift at the coffee shop. I started the therapy sessions Harold mentioned. The trust pays for it, so I figured I'd go." I leaned against my truck, the smell of fresh lumber and industrial paint in the air. I didn't say a word. I just listened to the sound of my sister realizing she was a person, not a project. "They turned me into a ghost, Claire," she whispered, her voice cracking over the sound of a bus stop announcement. Being the favorite, it wasn't a win. It was a trap. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a trophy they could polish so they could feel better about their own empty lives. Now that I'm not shiny anymore, they don't even look at me in that tiny apartment. I'm just another mouth they can't afford to feed. She waited. She was waiting for the big sister to come out. She wanted me to tell her it was okay, to offer her a room, to fix the broken glass. But I wasn't that person anymore. That girl died in a trench 3 tours ago. Start over, Megan, I said. My voice was a flat line of slate. Do the work, earn the life. Maybe in a couple of years we can have a cup of coffee, but not today. I hung up. I didn't feel mean. I felt honest. I moved into Grandma's house that weekend. I stripped the wallpaper Diane had picked out, that floral crap that smelled like desperation. I ripped up the curtains. I kept the Persian rug, though. I liked the history in the wool, even with the dents. The Yamaha arrived on a Thursday. A C7X Grand, jet black. The finish was so deep you could see every scar on your knuckles in the reflection. I didn't use the trust money for it. I used the hazard pay I'd stacked up from 3 deployments. I used the money I'd earned by staring down death while Richard was busy blowing his commissions on Napa Cabernet. The movers grunted as they slid it into the parlor. I watched them like a drill sergeant. I made sure the casters landed exactly in the 4 rectangular dents left by the Steinway. The fit was perfect. It didn't belong to a bloodline. It didn't belong to a legacy of stolen prestige. It belonged to me. I sat on the bench. The wood was cool through my jeans. I didn't play a nocturne. I didn't play for Grandma. I just pressed a single C-sharp. The sound was bright, aggressive, real. It didn't sound like a memory. It sounded like a new mission. 600 hours. This morning. The sun was a pale, honest orange smear over the Chicago skyline. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of black coffee, strong, bitter, and hot, filling the room. No cream, no sugar, just the stuff that keeps your eyes open when you've got a long day of rebuilding ahead. I wore an old gray sweatshirt, my dog tags rattling against my collarbone. I looked at the Yamaha sitting in the light. People ask me how I could do it. They use words like cold or hardened. They've never had to decide which limb to cut off to save the body. They've never had to hold a perimeter against the people who were supposed to be their reinforcements. Setting a boundary isn't an act of hate. It's a tactical necessity. It's realizing that family is a title earned through loyalty and sacrifice, not a debt you owe to people who share your blood, but none of your values. In war, you learn to spot the enemy. At home, you learn that sometimes the enemy is the one holding the camera in the family photos. I took a sip of the coffee. It burned, but it felt right. I walked over to the piano. I didn't look at the phone. I didn't check for messages. I just placed my hands on the keys and felt the weight of the morning sun on my shoulders. I was the last one standing in this house. And for the first time in 30 years, the silence didn't feel like a threat. That's the real legacy my grandmother left behind for me. And that's my story. Thanks for sticking around until the very end. If any of this hits close to home, if you've ever had to dig in and protect yourself from a family that made you feel invisible, I want you to know you aren't alone. Drawing a line in the sand isn't being selfish. It's how you value your own soul. Hit that like button if this story meant something to you. Subscribe if you want to hear more, and check out the description for other videos I think you'll find useful. Take care of yourself, and remember, you deserve to be seen.